Ok, muy buenas tardes a todos. En esta sesión de nuestro seminario permanente vamos a tener a Pamela Hieronymi. Ella es profesora en la Universidad de California, Los Ángeles. Los temas en los que principalmente investiga son ética, filosofía de la acción, libre albedrío. Ella se graduó de Harvard con un doctorado en el año 2000. Y hoy día nos hablará sobre justicia o equidad, sanciones y condenación. Estamos muy emocionados de tenerla y muchas gracias, Pamela. Emma.
So it's me now?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun and exciting. So there is a handout that is in the chat that you should be able to download. And I am also going to share my screen with some slides. The slides in the handout will be the same. But now let's see, are you seeing slides?
Not yet.
What has happened to my... Okay, let's stop and try one more time. And if not, I'll give it up. No?
Still says that start a screen sharing. I think it might be lagging a little bit too.
Oh, responsibility. And I've been particularly puzzled by its presumed relation to some strong requirement of freedom. The presumption seems to be that if we're not free in some very strong sense, then we're not truly responsible, and so we don't deserve condemnation. So I think I've made some progress on my puzzlement in an unexpected way. So although it's often noted that the fairness of a sanction requires an adequate opportunity to avoid the sanction, it's rarely asked why. That is, why does the fairness of the sanction require an opportunity to avoid it? And so by pressing on that question, I think I've come to better understand why someone might think that freely choosing to do wrong will itself have an extraordinarily strong and immediate effect on the way in which the interests of the wrongdoer should matter to the rest of us. That is, I think I've come to understand the relation between a strong form of freedom and a status that might be called condemnation, or a kind of desert that might be thought of as basic. And so I want to present here what I think I've learned. But importantly, in presenting this, I am presenting an idea that I do not endorse. In fact, I'm presenting an idea that I'm strongly opposed to. So I'm presenting this idea of condemnation, hoping that if what I say accurately captures what people have in mind, it'll also reveal to us how condemnation or desert in this sense can be left behind. I'm actually I spent a while working up my slides, so I'm going to try one more time to get the slides to work. I'm going to try one more route to the slides. Let's see if this will work. Let's see. There, did that work?
Yeah, we can see the second one, the introduction now.
Good. And now I have to figure out how on this route, I'm going to be presenting an idea of condemnation that I don't endorse. It's an idea that I'm strongly opposed to. And so I'm hoping that if what I say captures what people have in mind, it's going to show how condemnation or desert in that sense can be left behind. So to begin, I want to examine more carefully the idea of a sanction. To sanction someone is to impose something unwanted or unpleasant on that person in response to his or her violation of some demand or norm or expectation. Which is to say that sanctions are consequences that are created and attached to certain failures. So parents sanction children for misbehaving, nations impose sanctions on other nations for pursuing weapons programs, teachers penalize students for turning work in late. In contrast, a hangover is not a sanction for drinking too much. It's just a negative consequence. And similarly, the big mess in your kitchen is a negative consequence of last night's dinner party. The fact that you have to clean up that mess is not a sanction for having the party. It's just your job and it's no one else's job. But sanctions aren't simply negative consequences that no one else is required to bear for you. They're negative consequences that have been created and attached by some person or body to certain violations or shortcomings. And as such, they raise concerns of fairness. So we have two initial questions. First, why do sanctions, so understood, raise concerns of fairness? And second, why should fairness, the fairness of a sanction, require an opportunity to avoid it? Now, some people would answer both of those questions with a quick appeal to desert. They would say that sanctions require an opportunity to avoid because otherwise they're undeserved, and if they're undeserved, they're unfair. I find that appeal to desert unhelpful. And to see why, consider that it can be interpreted in two ways, which I'll label deflationary and substantive. On the deflationary reading, the question of whether you deserve this or that reduces to or is transparent to the question of whether giving it to you or imposing it on you would be apt, justified, or fair. And so in saying that without an adequate opportunity to avoid them, sanctions are undeserved, is just a different way of saying that without such an opportunity, they're inapt, unjustified, or unfair. And so the deflationary interpretation leaves our question untouched. Alternatively, you might think that facts about desert can themselves provide independent reason to think that sanctions are fair. I'll call this an appeal to substantive desert. So in this view, we can answer our original questions by appeal to desert, but then we immediately face further questions of why undeserved sanctions are unfair and why, without an adequate opportunity to avoid, sanctions are undeserved. And those further questions are difficult to answer. You might take the difficulty of answering those further questions as evidence that the claims are primitive or bedrock or basic. But I find the notion of substantive desert opaque, and so I find the appeal to it as basic or bedrock unsatisfying. Those who disagree could simply consider what follows as an alternative answer given by someone who is not content to take desert as bedrock. So here's an alternative answer to the question of why sanctions raise concerns of fairness. Unlike a hangover or the mess in your kitchen, sanctions are created, attached to certain failures, and imposed in given instances by some person or body through some voluntary action. And so they're subject to the moral concerns raised by any voluntary action that impacts the interests of someone else. Any voluntary action that impacts someone else's interests comes under the general ethical principle of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I take that to be about as bedrock a moral principle as you'll find, and I'm content to treat that as primitive. But importantly, an appeal to do unto others is not necessarily an appeal to fairness. On its face, it's an appeal to empathy. And as noted by Kant, it can often be used to ask for special treatment. In his example, a convicted criminal appeals to it to ask for mercy, that is, for special treatment from a sentencing judge. So to understand do unto others as counseling fairness, it has to be understood as generating principles that apply uniformly across the population. That is, and so understood, it directs us to treat each person as best we can, consistent with treating others in the same way. That is to say, it asks us to adopt principles that treat the needs and interests of each person symmetrically while doing adequately well by everyone. I will refer to those as principles of fairness. In coming to conclusions about fairness, what counts as symmetric or as adequately well is going to be hotly contested. But if we're contesting fairness, then it seems we're contesting whether a given policy or principle treats the interests of each symmetrically and adequately well. Here's an important caveat. What if some people take a special interest in, or a special delight in, or psychologically benefit from belittling others? Or what if some people have a special interest in or take special delight in being treated asymmetrically well relative to others? Must those interests be treated symmetrically with other interests in determining the principles of fairness? Plausibly, no. To propose that such interests be accommodated is to propose that we treat some asymmetrically poorly. But that proposal is incompatible with treating others symmetrically and adequately well. And so these interests need not, in fact, cannot be counted among those that must be symmetrically balanced and adequately served in a determination of fairness. Such interests are, we might say, silenced. So this idea of silencing is going to be important later. So in answer to our first question, the institution or imposition of a sanction raises concerns of fairness because it's a voluntary action that burdens other people. A sanction or a system of sanctions will be fair if, but only if, it treats the interests of each symmetrically while doing adequately well by all. I'm going to take that much as given and turn to our second question, which was, why would fairness require that sanctions be imposed only if there was adequate opportunity to avoid them? What's the connection between treating each symmetrically and adequately well and ensuring an adequate opportunity to avoid sanction? To start, we can notice a general presumption against imposing burdens on other people. That presumption has to be overcome if the sanction is to be justified. Typically, it's overcome by some important purpose served by the sanction. Typically, a sanction provides an incentive or a deterrent. That is to say, it influences people's choices in order to achieve certain goals or protect certain interests. So for example, instructors institute late penalties to provide students an incentive to submit their work by the deadline, thus ensuring both that students have roughly the same amount of time to complete the assignment and that the instructor has adequate time to mark and return it, enabling learning in the term. Importantly, the fact that a system of sanctions serves a purpose doesn't make the justification of sanctioning in a particular case forward-looking or consequentialist. Because once instituted, a system of sanctions is fair only if it's uniformly enforced. And enforcement is always going to be backward-looking. Because a system of sanctions is fair only if it treats each person's interests symmetrically and adequately well, the importance of serving the purposes of the sanction must be sufficient to overcome the risk of incurring the burden that's faced by each individual. So it would be unfair, for example, to completely impoverish those who turn work in late, even if that sanction were symmetrically enforced. Because the risk to each person of incurring such a sanction through bad luck or false accusation far outweighs its benefits. So though that sanction would treat each person symmetrically, it would not treat them adequately well. Notice, because it's going to be important later, that the disproportionately severe sanction is ruled out not just because it is in some brute or intuitive way disproportionate, but specifically because, given the severity of the sanction, the risk of incurring it outweighs its benefit, and so it fails to treat each person adequately well. Of course, in the absence of any opportunity to avoid a sanction, imposing it couldn't provide the intended incentive or deterrent. Because without an opportunity to avoid it, there's nothing for the sanction to influence. And so if we were to institute a system of sanctions that remains insensitive to one's opportunity to avoid, we would put people at risk of incurring pointless harm. It would be better if our system made exceptions for cases in which there was no opportunity to avoid. And in fact, such exceptions seem required by fairness. So here's an answer to the second question. Fair sanctions require an adequate opportunity to avoid because without such an opportunity, imposing the sanction will burden interests for no purpose. Doing so fails to treat the interests of each symmetrically and adequately well, and so is unfair. But we now face a third question, and the third question will ultimately bring us to the issue of freedom. The third question is this: what makes a person's opportunity to avoid sanction adequate for fairness. Here's an initial natural hypothesis. A student has an adequate opportunity to avoid the late penalty just in case the student faces a choice or a series of choices by which they could successfully avoid that penalty. That natural hypothesis can be supported in two very different ways. The first repeats what we said above. If the student did not face a choice by which they could avoid the penalty, then there was nothing for the penalty to incentivize. Supported in this way, choice is necessary for fairness. An alternative rationale will appeal to control and to something like desert, reasoning that if the student faced a choice, then it was up to the student whether they incurred the penalty or not. And because the penalty was in that way in the student's control, they can't complain that the burden is unfair. They made their bed, so they can lie in it. So in this way of thinking, choice is sufficient for the fair penalty. The natural hypothesis, I'm going to argue, is incorrect. The fact that someone faces a choice is neither necessary nor sufficient to ensure that they had an adequate opportunity to avoid the sanction. First, choice isn't sufficient. Suppose the assignment was given on short notice during a period in which the student faced a series of time-consuming events of familial, religious, or cultural importance. It's plausible that even though the student may now knowingly choose to incur the penalty and could have instead chosen to complete the assignment and avoid the penalty may nonetheless be unfair, and unfair because the student didn't have an adequate opportunity to avoid it. Whether the opportunity is adequate turns in part on the quality of the opportunity, so to speak. That is to say, on the other burdens that one will incur in order to avoid it. So choice is not necessarily sufficient. More surprisingly, choice is also not necessary for an adequate opportunity to avoid. So consider a student who just forgot about the assignment or who overslept and missed the deadline. There was no choice that the student faced by which they could avoid the sanction. And yet, depending on the circumstances, the student may have had an adequate opportunity to avoid it. Now that surprising conclusion requires some investigation. So let's focus on the student who overslept. The oversleeping student may try to advance the argument we gave above, namely, enforcing the late penalty on oversleepers doesn't provide an effective incentive. Someone who oversleeps can't turn back time to correct their error. And so the sanction burdens oversleepers for no purpose, and so it's unfair. So that line of reasoning, I think, can be challenged in two ways. First, you might argue that enforcing the late penalty on the oversleeper does provide an incentive. It creates an incentive for students to take steps to ensure that they don't oversleep or to turn their work in a bit in advance. Now that first challenge basically just insists that the oversleeping student did face some choice by which they could have avoided the penalty. Maybe a choice to stay up very late or a choice to put off the work until the last moment. But one might object. Even though oversleeping can sometimes be avoided through better planning, sometimes it can't. Sometimes even the most conscientious of students with excellent time management habits, a reliable alarm clock, a plan to submit the work in advance, can find that everything goes wrong and really there was nothing they could have done to avoid missing the deadline. Even the most conscientious will sometimes fail through sheer bad luck. And enforcing the penalty in that case, one might think, is unfair. Okay, so in reply, notice first that when we say that really there was nothing the fully conscientious student could have done, in contrast to the student who could have better managed their time, we're not marking a difference in the metaphysical freedom of these two students. When we say that the fully conscientious student could not have avoided the penalty, we're not ruling out all counterfactual possibility of avoiding it. Strictly speaking, there were things that the fully conscientious student might have done. They might have set a second or a third alarm clock, for example. In fact, we can stipulate that determinism is false, that the student enjoys libertarian freedom, and that the student owns 3 working alarm clocks. Even so, the conscientious oversleeper could still complain that there was nothing they could have done to avoid the penalty. In saying that, what they're saying is that they did everything we could reasonably expect them to have done, and yet failed through sheer bad luck. To say they failed through sheer bad luck is to say they did everything that could reasonably be expected of them, and yet, surprisingly, they didn't thereby avoid the failure. In that kind of case, you might think that the penalty now serves no purpose and is therefore unfair. We should carve out an exception for the conscientious oversleeper, though maybe not for the typical oversleeper. But we now encounter the second challenge. Sometimes making exceptions will generate costs that are greater than the cost of the sanction. And if so, choosing instead to enforce the sanction may yet treat each person symmetrically and adequately well. That is, it may yet be fair, even though the one on whom the sanction is enforced did all they reasonably could be expected to do and failed through sheer bad luck. We might say that enforcing the sanction in that kind of case serves the secondary purpose of avoiding the costs of making an exception. Okay, to explain. The institution and administration of a sanction in practice is going to implicate interests beyond those most directly served by it. And those further interests are going to be highly context dependent. So for example, the interests of both the instructor and the students require that enforcing the sanction not involve a significant expenditure of the instructor's time, nor a significant invasion of the student's privacy. The interests of the students require that the policy not be too easily gamed. Those further interests are going to have different implications in a very large class than they will in a very small one. And they're also going to have different implications in an extremely competitive environment in which gaming the system will be more tempting or more prevalent than it will in a very cooperative culture in which there might be more trust. Notice next that the task of discriminating between the fully conscientious and the less than fully conscientious student is neither easy nor costless. Unless the instructor both is and is known to be not only familiar with, but also a judicious and objective judge of the character of all the students, the instructor won't be able to decide whether a student is fully conscientious or honest by appeal to their sense of the students without risking serious unfairness. One might guard against those risks by requiring some sort of investigation, but that will likely require an unacceptable invasion of the student's privacy. One might try allowing oversleeping generally to be a reason for exemption, but one might then need to grant a lot of exemptions, allowing for other kinds of bad luck in the interest of fairness. One might try to accommodate the bad luck by allowing everyone a one-time exception to the late policy, but that's an imperfect solution. It's going to reduce the effectiveness of the policy generally, and it doesn't address the fact that someone could encounter genuine bad luck twice in a term. So taking into account all of those difficulties, we might sometimes conclude that making an exception for the fully conscientious is going to create costs that are higher than the cost of the late penalty. And we might then conclude that the system that serves each student's interests most fully and fairly will enforce the late penalty, even in certain cases in which we admit the student made no poor choice, and simply suffers from bad luck. The bad luck, we might think, will be acceptably distributed. The cost of rooting it out of the system is high. And so we might think it's consistent with fairness to let the bad luck fall where it does. We might think that the risk of incurring the late penalty through bad luck is a risk we can each accept, a cost worth incurring, given the gains to be had by implementing the late penalty. And in that kind of case, enforcing the late penalty will be fair because it will treat each symmetrically and adequately well. Okay, so summarizing this case of the conscientious oversleeper, the sanction is triggered by failing to meet the deadline. But it's possible to trigger the sanction even though one has made all the choices that the sanction was designed to incentivize. The trigger isn't the failed choice, but rather some typical consequence of them. In some of the cases in which the trigger was tripped through bad luck, an exception can be fairly made. For example, when someone's hospitalized and so fails to turn in their paper. Fairness then requires an exception. But sometimes making an exception introduces too many other costs, as with oversleeping. And in such a case, the sanction might be fairly enforced, even though no poor choices were made. So surprisingly, choice is not necessary for fairness. Now that conclusion is going to be very controversial. So before considering the controversy, though, I want to return to our third question. What makes a person's opportunity to avoid a sanction adequate for fairness? We now face what will turn out to be a purely notational choice about how to use the word adequate. We might want an adequate opportunity to ensure that so long as you avoid poor choices, you also avoid the penalty. That is to say, we might want an adequate opportunity to protect against bad luck. In that case, the cases like the conscientious oversleeper will show that an adequate opportunity is not required for fairness after all. Alternatively, we might insist that fairness requires an adequate opportunity, but allow that an adequate opportunity doesn't necessarily guard against bad luck. The first option, according to which adequate opportunity rules out bad luck, fits very nicely with our intuitions about desert, but it carries two very high costs. First, it's going to be extremely difficult, probably impossible, to determine when someone who tripped the trigger had an adequate opportunity to avoid doing so, because we're going to need to determine whether the failure was due to poor choices, and that's going to require specifying what could be reasonably expected at each decision point that led to the failure. And while some things will be obvious, don't stay up late without setting an alarm, there's going to be a significant and yet reasonable disagreement about a lot of the details. Should you set a second alarm every night before every important deadline? How important? We're going to reasonably disagree about these details, even if we could agree that the deadline itself is reasonable. Worse, a person could fail in the details, fail to set a second alarm, for example, due to bad luck. And so then we'll need to determine whether they had an adequate opportunity to set that second alarm. And the problem's going to repeat at that point. So even if we were to agree on the details, the task is still going to be unworkably large. But a second cost might offset the first, which is that although it may be impossible to determine whether someone had an adequate opportunity, there's also not going to be any need to do so, because once we insist that bad luck renders the opportunity inadequate, adequate opportunity is no longer required for fairness. So I prefer the second option. I prefer to insist that fairness requires an adequate opportunity to avoid, but to allow that an adequate opportunity is no guarantee against bad luck. We're going to then determine whether the opportunity was adequate by determining whether enforcing the sanction would be unfair. If enforcing the sanction would be unfair because of bad luck, as when hospitalized or in a car accident, the opportunity was inadequate. But if the bad luck doesn't undermine the fairness of the penalty, then it also doesn't undermine the adequacy of the opportunity, as in the case of the conscientious oversleeper. So there's a benefit of this second option, and that is not only can we grant without arguing the details that the conscientious sleeper did everything that we could reasonably expect them to do to avoid missing the deadline, we can also add short of missing the deadline. That is, we can maintain that the deadline sets a reasonable expectation while granting that it's sometimes possible to miss it despite making all the right choices. So the deadline remains reasonable for the same complex set of reasons that show that the penalty remains fair. Okay, so that use of adequate is going to be controversial, but again, it only makes a notational difference to the argument below. The real source of controversy is the claim that a sanction can be fairly enforced when the trigger was tripped due to bad luck. And so I'm going to consider objections to that in the next section. Before we get there, two final observations. First, in order for the system of sanctions to treat each, including those who might incur it through bad luck, symmetrically and adequately well, the possibility of incurring it through bad luck should be minimized. The risk of incurring the sanction through bad luck has to be weighed against the interest served by it, resulting in what we could call the minimally effective sanction. And therefore, notice that the interests of the unlucky are not silenced in the determination of the penalty in the way in which an interest in belittling others or an interest in special treatment are silenced. Instead, the interests of the unlucky count just as much as anyone's in constraining the sanction. Notice second, that these same considerations about fairness could be reached when the inability to avoid the sanction is due to constitutional weakness of the individual. So consider in this regard, Professor Procrastinate. Like most professors, Professor Procrastinate regularly takes books from the library. But due to his inveterate procrastination, Procrastinate is sure to miss the deadline for returning them. So let's stipulate that Procrastinate lacks the ability to avoid the late fine. Is enforcing the late fine, therefore, unfair? Plausibly, no. Plausibly, details have to be filled in, but plausibly Procrastinate would instead, due to his constitutional weakness, fairly lose his lending privileges. He may need to do his work in the library. Okay, so we've now answered our three questions. Sanctions trigger concerns of fairness because they're created and imposed through voluntary actions that burden the interests of others. They require an adequate opportunity to avoid because without such an opportunity, they burden interests for no purpose and thereby fail to treat each person symmetrically and adequately well. But in some cases in which a person trips the trigger of a sanction despite doing all that could be reasonably expected to avoid it, enforcing the sanction could still be fair. That is, it could still treat each person symmetrically and adequately well because it serves some secondary purpose. And so if adequate opportunity to avoid a sanction is required for fairness, it's possible to have had an adequate opportunity to avoid it, even if you did all that could be reasonably expected to avoid it, as with the oversleeping student. And it seems even if you suffer from some constitutional weakness that prevents you from avoiding it, such as with Procrastinate. So adequate opportunity doesn't rule out bad luck, or taking the other notational choice, if it does, it's not required for fairness. Now that surprising final conclusion transgresses ordinary intuitions about fairness, about the fairness of sanctions, intuitions that you might express using the word desert. So even though you might reluctantly grant that a late penalty could be fairly enforced on the unlucky for the reasons given above, you might still feel that the unlucky don't really deserve the penalty precisely because they did all that could be reasonably expected. So I'm now going to turn to that objection. The objector grants that there's some sense in which a late penalty might be fairly enforced on the unlucky, but the objector wants to mark a distinction between what might be called truly fair and the merely fair in practice. A late penalty is truly fair, the objector might say, only if the person hasn't done all that could be reasonably expected, short of tripping the trigger. If instead the person trips the trigger through bad luck, the penalty is only fair in practice. Now, I have no objection to marking the difference between cases in which the person did or didn't do all that could be reasonably expected, that is, cases in which the sanction is or is not serving its original rather than some secondary purpose. But I doubt that that difference is well labeled as a difference between the truly fair and something else. Because if fairness is a matter of treating each person's interests symmetrically and adequately well, then the penalty is fair, full stop, in both cases. The fact that in certain cases the sanction doesn't serve the original purpose of providing an incentive doesn't bear on its fairness, so understood. So one might try again. One might suggest that the unlucky cases arise only because of unfortunate practical limitations. That is, only because we can't perfectly align the trigger and the poor choice. And one might think that in a perfect world, the trigger would be failure due to poor choice. And then without a poor choice, the sanction would be unfair because, so to speak, inaccurate. You did never trip the trigger. Now, I see the temptation here But I doubt that even in an ideal world, we would want to identify the trigger with a poor choice. Because I doubt that even in an ideal world, we would have as much agreement about the details of planning or as much transparency of our thought and behavior to one another or even to ourselves as that would require. And so I think there are very good reasons to let the trigger of a sanction be an outcome simply, rather than a choice. But one could idealize not by imagining agreement or transparency amongst ourselves, but rather by imagining that the sanction is somehow magically, or perhaps better divinely and omnisciently, enforced only when the person didn't do all that could be reasonably expected. Then the trigger could be failure due to poor choice. And in the unlucky case, the sanction would be unfair because inaccurate. And so in this magically or divinely ordered world, one could always avoid a fair sanction by making good choices. Okay, so that is in fact the ordinary intuition about desert, that truly deserved sanctions require poor choices. But we should again wonder, why should true fairness require omniscience or magic? That is, why should it be a matter of fairness that the trigger for a sanction should be the poor choice rather than an outcome, given that short of agreement, transparency, omniscience, or magic, we're still able to treat one another symmetrically and adequately well? Now, here you might think, well, because we ought, as a matter of fairness, to be able to control whether bad things happen to us by making good choices. That, I think, is a very powerful intuition, but I am very sorry to say that it seems to me a fantasy. It's an understandable fantasy, and in certain ways it's a noble one, but I think it's a fantasy nonetheless. Life is not in this way fair, nor could we in our interactions or our social institutions make it to be so for the reasons given above about transparency and agreement. So that you could not have avoided a burden by choosing well doesn't entail that the burden is unfair, though if the burden is a sanction, it makes it very likely to be unfair for the reasons given above. Sanctions should typically be avoidable. Still, the intuition that an unlucky sanction is always undeserved or unfair remains strong, and so it needs further accounting. So let's try the objection one more time. Someone might, at this point, raise the objection in a new guise. They might say that we've been misled by considering the wrong cases. Late penalties and library fines, understood in the way I've suggested, aren't moral sanctions, as clearly shown by the fact that the penalty can be fairly imposed despite bad luck. So no one would think that incurring the penalty per se is a reason for guilt or condemnation, opprobrium, moral judgment. The penalty has been stripped of any distinctively moral force or significance. And that distinctive moral significance, one might say, is what raises these special concerns about fairness, luck, and opportunity. To make that objection more stark, we can introduce a distinction between a price and a moral sanction. The objector might claim that systems of sanctions, as I describe them, are just pricing systems designed to achieve certain goals or solve certain problems. For the partying student, the late penalty is the price of partying. For the conscientious oversleeper, the penalty is bad luck, a kind of bad luck we created when we created the pricing system. So the risk of bad luck of this sort is the price of the pricing system, so to speak. But moral sanctions, you might think, are a different beast. Their distinctive significance raises special considerations of fairness. Their justification isn't sensitive to these secondary purposes in this pragmatic way that a pricing system might be. Okay, good. So then what is a moral sanction? One might reply, flat-footedly, but I think accurately enough, that it's a sanction for a moral failing. And further, moral sanctions, you might say, differ from others only in the special significance that they carry. So ordinary sanctions like monetary policies, grade deductions, restrictions of movement can become moral sanctions when they are incurred for a moral failing. And then they somehow take on a distinctive kind of significance. Likewise, certain forms of treatment, like avoiding somebody or explaining in detail what they did wrong, might become a moral sanction, might become condemnation or reproach when it's incurred for a moral failing. In that case, moral sanctions don't differ from others materially, so to speak, but rather in their special significance. So then why does that special moral significance require a poor choice? Well, as an initial answer, we can note that a lot of people just identify moral failings with immoral choices. And so it would then follow that moral sanctions are unfair without an immoral choice because, again, they would be inaccurate. You didn't trip the trigger. So by putting these thoughts together, we can now, in a satisfying way, account for the difference between truly fair sanctions and those that are only fair in practice. Without an immoral choice, the distinctive significance of a moral sanction is unfair because it's inaccurate. And that could be so even if the ordinary sanction, the grade deduction or the fine, could still be fairly imposed once stripped of that moral significance. And so sanctions carrying moral significance have to be truly fair. That is, they have to be incurred for immoral choices, while sanctions stripped of that significance might nonetheless be fair in practice. Okay, so that much seems to me both plausible and opaque. So if we accept it for the time being, I think we can ask two remaining questions. The first question is, what is this special moral significance? And the second is, why should it, whatever it is, be reserved for or deserved only by immoral choices? I'm going to call those the remaining questions. And I think I've stumbled across an answer to those remaining questions that might make sense of what people have in mind by basic desert, condemnation, or true moral responsibility, and might connect those to an especially strong form of freedom. And so in what follows, I'm going to present my answer by engaging in an admittedly odd exercise. But at this point, we can take a break.
Thank you very much. So why don't we take a 3-minute break and then we come back with some questions, if that's fine.
Great.
Okay.
Or no.
Okay. You can send them to me.
Okay, let me, do you have Keynote? Because they're in Keynote. The Apple program?
Yeah, I do have Keynote.
Okay, great. I'll have a whiteboard to write on if people want, if I want to write on things to answer questions.
Yeah. So I know that Nuri and I have a question. And
okay, great.
We can continue after that. Ahora vamos a hacer las preguntas. Primero va a ir Nurit. So Nurit. So Pamela, are you there?
Yep.
Okay. So Nurit is going first. Nurit.
Yep.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for this first half. I had a tiny clarificatory question, which was just about the notion of bad luck. And I was trying to wrap my head around how the line is drawn between bad luck and one being able to say that no, it's unreasonable that put yourself in that situation or not. So I imagine it's not going to be like a clear-cut line or anything like that, but I was trying to grasp how we divide between those two.
Yeah. So so actually in this case, the ethics is going to be driving the metaphysics. So it's going to be bad luck just in case you did everything we could reasonably expect you to do and yet failed. So so when something is bad luck turns on what's reasonable, and what's reasonable is going to be a substantive ethical question.
Okay, awesome, thanks. So I guess so the same scenario of different person could be bad luck for one of them and not bad luck for the other, right? Just because it's not reasonable for one of them and reasonable for the other, perhaps for particular features of the person.
Yes, though whether that's so in the case of something like a policy like a late penalty is going to depend on whether it's reasonable to make the penalty that fine-grained. But yes.
Okay, Pyro.
Oh, thanks, Pamela, for this first half too. I just have a quick clarificatory question. Can you characterize a little bit more the difference between so the pricing system and moral sanction? Because someone could think that, well, that's what I thought at least, that that moral sanctions work precisely like a pricing system, but with a different currency. So it's not, but it's well-being or any other variable there. You put it in terms of significance and force. So can you characterize it a bit?
Sure. So it's my way of trying to give life to or make plausible the objection. So I say that the conscientious oversleeper can still be fairly incur the late penalty. And then I'm imagining somebody saying, oh, no, not really. I mean, it's not truly fair. I see what you're saying, Hieronymi, but it's not really fair. And so that person tries to say, okay, fine, it's fair in practice, or now it's fair as a pricing system. I get that you want some sort of pricing system here, and that's fine. You can have that, but notice that incurring the late penalty, now that I've understood how it's actually working for you, Hieronymi, it's not a reason for guilt or condemnation or any sort of self-reproach. It's just, it's just bad luck. It's just the price of turning in on your work late. As opposed to an actual moral sanction. And that kind of thing can't be fairly incurred through bad luck. So this is the objector trying to make this distinction. And I say, okay, I hear what you're saying. What's a moral sanction? To which the person, my imagined objector, says, well, it's a sanction that comes with a special sort of significance. It's a significance that when you've done something morally wrong, now you need to feel guilt. Now you, and then I'm about to, in part 2 here, say that special significance is might be understood to be something I'm going to call condemnation. So I'm going to try to flesh that out a little bit more, and show how something that might be thought of as that special significance might be tightly connected to an idea of freedom that might explain why people think that moral condemnation or moral sanction requires a very, very strong form of freedom. Great. So I'm sort of deep in this dialectic, so it's a little complicated.
Yeah, but I follow. Yeah, thanks for it.
Okay, we have Diego.
Yeah, I just had a small comment on something that seemed to me a bit odd about your reply to Nudit, which was that if the ethics kind of determines the metaphysics, then the ethics determines what's unreasonable or unreasonable for an agent to do to avoid a sanction. But it also determines like whether an agent should be sanctioned, right? Right. So it seems to me that those are cases in which just the ethics determine whether an agent should be sanctioned, even if it's like unreasonable to expect more of the agent by the same ethics, So
I see.
It seems like there's some sort of conflict there, but I don't know if it's a contradiction. It seems like there's some sort of conflict there. I don't know what you have to say about that.
Yeah, good. No, I see what you're saying, and so that's because there's this sort of 2-step right? There's the primary purpose of the sanction, which is to provide an incentive. And typically, when that primary purpose isn't satisfied, you can make an exception. But then sometimes it's going to turn out that making an exception would itself be unfair for some secondary reason. And that's why you can say that the late penalty was reasonable. And what you might mean by that is I gave it in plenty of, I announced the assignment in plenty of time. It wasn't over an important holiday. The students have a reasonable amount of time to do it. And yet this person did everything reasonable that we could reasonably expect them to have done, and yet failed to get their work in. But it's still reasonable to enforce it because making an exception in this case, and now you have to wheel in all the other details, it would be too costly, or would itself be unfair. So it's like the reasonableness is operating in two different spots, is what's making it have that feel of contradiction.
Oh, thanks.
Okay, so I had a question about this idea of interests being silenced. So what I wanted you to explain a little bit more about this, because I am thinking of a population that in their culture they are willing to accept a lot of sacrifices, and so their interest is, oh, okay, I don't mind if I sacrifice myself, or if I even give my life. Should we treat those interests symmetrically to other interests that will be, let's say, more reasonable? And this is in Scanlon's, I think, contractualism versus utilitarianism paper. So I just wanted to know, what were you thinking about this idea of symmetry of interest?
Great. So the interests that I was thinking of as silenced are the mirror image, so to speak, of the ones you were thinking. So I was thinking of the person who wants to be treated especially well, and then wants us to take into consideration, when we're trying to figure out how to treat everyone fairly, the fact that they, so you get special delight out of going for long bike rides. I get special delight out of being, out of lording it over you, or being more special than you. Do we have to take my interest in being special into account in the same way that we have to take in your interest in long bike rides and recreation? No, I want to say, and in fact, it sort of returns a system error if you try to do that, because what this person is asking for is exactly to be treated asymmetrically well. And so you can't figure out how to symmetrically treat an interest in being treated asymmetrically well. And so that's why I wanted to say that it's silenced, it's impossible, it's incoherent, it's like dividing by zero, something like that. But now you're asking about a case I haven't thought about, which is, what if somebody wants to be treated asymmetrically poorly?
This Scanlon is not me.
Yeah, no, it's and I mean it's actually it's Parfit. It's what Parfit pressed. It's the reason Scanlon's formula has the double negative in it. Is that Parfit pressed just exactly this kind of case on him, and Scanlon did not want to say that that it would be unreasonable for somebody to volunteer to be a that it wouldn't be to volunteer to be treated less well, but it would be reasonable for somebody to refuse to volunteer. And that's why you get the no one could reasonably reject. In violation of principles, no one could reasonably reject. But so if I had an interest in always being treated second best, could that, yeah, I think that's going to be silenced just as well in this, in the way that I'm thinking of it. Though it could be that a system of rules might take into account an interest in being able to put others above yourself on occasion. But then is it going to also, with the same reasoning, let you take in an interest in being able to an interest in being treated asymmetrically well, I think that is going to be silenced. Something that might seem nearby is not, and that is an interest in being able to give partiality to yourself and the people near and dear to you under certain situations. And the reason that that's not silenced is that we can allow that to be part of what everyone wants symmetrically. Right? So everyone would like to, under certain circumstances, be able to treat themselves and their family and their friends partially. And therefore, partiality can, be something that we allow everyone and allow everyone in a symmetric way. And so maybe we could also, in a similar move, allow for people to be heroic, make that permissible for everyone without it.
Yeah, that was a little bit of what I was thinking, like a father maybe trying to protect their children and putting his life and those ideas.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that should fit in a way that trying to take directly into account an interest in being treated asymmetrically well relative to everybody else should not fit in. We just lost my screen share, didn't we? Let's try that again.
Yeah. But okay. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Did you want me to keep going, or are there more questions?
No, mine was the last one. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, so let me see where we are. So this next bit is shorter than the bit that we already went through. So we'll have more time for questions, I think, at the end. So where were we? Well, we had just seen that. Oh, I see. Hold on. Sorry, I need to get where I can see my text. There we go. Sorry, so we were just where we saw that sanctions that carry a moral significance, the objector said, have to be truly fair. That is to say, they have to be incurred for poor choices, while sanctions that are stripped of that special moral significance could be nonetheless fair in practice. And so they could be fairly incurred in cases of bad luck. And I said that seems both plausible, it seems like a natural intuitive read of what the objection is to the conscientious oversleeper and why you want to say it doesn't really deserve it. But it also seems opaque to me. And so the remaining questions that I want to ask to sort of resolve the opacity are these. First, what is this distinctive significance or force that is in response to a distinctively moral failing? And second, why should that force be reserved for immoral choices? And so to answer those questions, I'm going to ask us to sort of take a sidestep and start to engage in what I will agree with you is a kind of odd exercise or sort of weird thing to do. And it involves several steps. First, I want to assume what I'm going to call moral freedom. So that is to say, moral freedom is something that many ethicists have assumed, and that is that insofar as we're subject to moral requirements, we are also thereby at each point able to avoid violating those requirements, no matter our contingent psychology, history, or environment. So as it's sometimes put, ought implies can. So we have this degree of freedom. Our history and our environment won't prevent us from doing what's morally required. I'm going to call that moral freedom, which is short for freedom to do what is morally required. The assumption of moral freedom is extremely strong. If moral requirements require not only making the right choices, but also bringing about certain outcomes, then we couldn't enjoy moral freedom because the world is often and obviously uncooperative. And so to make moral freedom plausible, we need to shrink our duties, so to speak, so that when things go wrong despite our best efforts, we've done no moral wrong. So moral failing now is going to be a failing of willing. So let that be so for the purposes of our exercise. But even that restriction might not be enough because humans are born unable to satisfy ordinary adult obligations, and moral development is a messy and uncertain and contingent affair. So some people seem to reach adulthood without the ability to make good choices. They're too insensitive, too petty, too frail of ego. In the face of those apparent counterexamples, the advocate of moral freedom might shrink moral duties even further. They might say that those unfortunate souls who lack the ability to satisfy moral demands are for that reason not subject to those demands. And so some people aren't actually failing morally when they seem to be, though it will be difficult to tell who, when. Again, let that be so for the purposes of this exercise. Opposite the presumption of moral freedom stands what we might call sloppily the presumption of original sin. The claim that we are unable to do, that we are unable to do what we're nonetheless morally required to do. At its very strongest, the presumption of original sin would claim that we're never able to avoid wrong choices, that our choices or our motives are always corrupt. It's actually closer to total deprivation. But a weaker version of this claims that although we're sometimes able to choose well, at other times we can find ourselves unable to do what morality requires. And even that weaker and I think very plausible version of original sin is ruled out by moral freedom. Okay, so with the presumption of moral freedom in place, we begin our odd exercise. Let us, as before, consider the fairness of sanctions, still understood as incentives, but now understood as incentives to make morally required choices. And let us further stipulate that the trigger is the immoral choice, so that the sanction is going to be unfair because inaccurate without a moral choice, an immoral choice. Now, given moral freedom, under what conditions would a sanction for an immoral choice be fair? Notice first that by stipulating that the choice is immoral, we have eliminated the concern about what we earlier called the quality of the opportunity to avoid the sanction. So unlike the student who was given an assignment on extremely short notice, the quality of an opportunity to avoid wrongdoing is always adequate. And that's because to say that the choice is wrong is to say that the costs of avoiding the choice, the potential burdens that a wrongdoer would bear to avoid making that choice, don't justify making it. Notice next that by stipulating that the trigger for the sanction is the choice itself, and by stipulating moral freedom, we've eliminated the possibility of incurring the sanction even though you have done all that could be reasonably expected. We've eliminated bad luck. Because by stipulation, all that was reasonably expected was a choice, and given moral freedom, that could be reasonably expected. Unfortunately, though, we haven't eliminated the possibility of false accusation, and so we have to continue to institute only the minimally effective sanction. And again, that requirement can appear under the label proportionality. The severity of the sanction must not exceed the importance of providing the incentive, lest it put the innocent at risk of needless harm. Okay, so far so good. Now I want to consider an even narrower, odder question. Suppose that we could somehow, maybe with omniscience, eliminate all possibility of false accusation. Now, given moral freedom, under what conditions would sanctions treat a correctly accused wrongdoer fairly? Or to put the question differently, in establishing principles that govern a system of sanctions that treat each person symmetrically and adequately well, how would we take into account the interests of those who in fact make immoral choices? It seems to me the answer must be we won't. or better, under the presumption of moral freedom, when considering the fairness of a sanction for an immoral choice, we can't take into account the interests of the person who made the immoral choice. And that's because in presuming moral freedom, we've guaranteed that the burdens imposed by such a sanction are something that any potential wrongdoer both could avoid because of moral freedom and should avoid themselves by choosing well. And so once we eliminate the possibility of false accusation, there is no risk of incurring the sanction apart from choosing wrongly. But choosing wrongly is something that, under the presumption of moral freedom, everyone can always avoid. And so to seek to protect the interests that would be burdened by a sanction against choosing wrongly is, under the presumption of moral freedom, tantamount to seeking to protect an interest in choosing to do wrong. That is, to maintain the possibility of doing wrong without harming your own interest too much. But an interest in doing wrong or in choosing wrongly is an interest in treating someone else's interests asymmetrically or inadequately well. And an interest in that, like an interest in being treated asymmetrically well or in belittling other people, is incompatible with the aims of fairness. It can't coherently be taken into account. It can't coherently be added to those that have to be treated symmetrically and adequately well. And so it's silenced. So objections are going to be raised to this line of reasoning, and I'm going to consider some. But before I do that, let's notice first how it answers the remaining questions. According to what we've said, by freely choosing wrongly, you therein silence your own interests. That is to say, you forfeit any claim of fairness that might be raised by appeal to your interests. And so by freely choosing wrongly, you therein immediately incur a kind of status, a kind of defenselessness or moral vulnerability to sanction. And that silencing of your interests, that moral vulnerability or defenselessness, might be the special significance of specifically moral sanction. So I'm going to hereafter call it condemnation. And that label seems to me appropriate if we hear in it condemning to, like condemning to death, prison, hell, or some other kind of exile, banishment, or separateness from those of us who are not condemned. Notice too that if the above line of reasoning is correct, or if it's even available, we have a way not only to understand the special force or significance of moral sanction, but we also have an explanation of why that significance is deserved in a basic way, that is without further story, when one chooses freely to do wrong. A freely made immoral choice silences one's interests and determinations of fairness. And so if the above line of reasoning is available to us, we have a way of diagnosing or understanding why someone might think that a freely made immoral choice will itself have an extraordinarily strong and immediate effect on the way in which the interests or well-being of the wrongdoer should matter to the rest of us. Okay. Now turning now to some objections. The linchpin of the argument I gave is the claim that, given moral freedom, an interest in avoiding sanction for a wrong done is tantamount to an interest in doing wrong. And one might object. In particular, one might point out that even given moral freedom, we should still expect ourselves sometimes to do wrong. Humans are subject to temptation, and we are going to remain so even if graced with moral freedom. And so even given moral freedom, even though given moral freedom, everyone both could and should choose rightly, we have to acknowledge that choosing against wrongdoing is often extremely difficult. And so we should expect ourselves sometimes to do wrong, even though we always have the ability to avoid it. But if we can expect ourselves sometimes to do wrong, then one might argue, an interest in avoiding sanction for a wrong done is not tantamount to an interest in doing wrong. It's instead an interest in fair treatment after the predictable and regrettable fact of wrongdoing. Okay, so now I'm going to reply to that. So importantly, we can indeed, consistent with moral freedom, predict that we will sometimes freely do wrong. Nonetheless, under the presumption of moral freedom, we cannot, consistently with the aims of fairness and in good faith, plan to do wrong. That is, moral freedom rules out the possibility that you might find yourself in the position of Professor Procrastinate, or in the position of Ulysses approaching the sirens, needing to anticipate and plan around your own constitutional weakness, because under the presumption of moral freedom, you don't have any such weakness. So if you were to plan around your own predicted wrongdoing, you would immediately, so to speak, confront your victim. To plan to do wrong is to plan to treat someone else's interests unfairly. And so if you were to try to plan around your own predicted wrongdoing, your predicted victim could rightly protest. A better plan is just to avoid the wrongdoing. In fact, fairness requires it. And given moral freedom, you can't, consistently with the aims of fairness and in good faith, make such plans. In fact, a prediction of wrongdoing, together with the interests of potential victims, is what provided the justification for instituting sanctions understood as incentives. Although we can't in good faith plan around unavoidable wrongdoing, because wrongdoing is not unavoidable given moral freedom, we can in good faith make plans to reduce temptation. We can make plans to make choosing well less difficult. We thereby provide ourselves with a way to strengthen our resolve and protect the interests of potential victims. And so if a potential wrongdoer predicts wrongdoing, then once we remember the victim, it may seem that the right response is not to curtail the sanction, but to strengthen it, to make it more daunting and so more effective. The stronger the sanction, the more we will have reinforced the wrongdoer's native ability to always choose well. If a potential wrongdoer objects, suggesting that the sanction instead be curtailed, the potential victim could make the following argument. The victim is unable to protect themselves against the burdens imposed on them by the wrong done. The victim is, so to speak, at the mercy of the wrongdoer. But given moral freedom, the wrongdoer can avoid both the burdens that they impose on the victim and the burdens that will be imposed on them in the sanction simply by choosing well, which is, by stipulation, what fairness requires. So for the wrongdoer to claim that the sanction is unfair is to suggest that the victim accept a risk that the wrongdoer both could and should neutralize by incurring only those costs that we have already outweighed in determining that the action is wrong. So to suggest that the victim should accept a risk that the wrongdoer should and could costlessly, so to speak, neutralize, is to claim that the interests of the victim should be treated asymmetrically poorly. And such a claim is incompatible with deliberations of fairness and will be silenced. So this silencing idea is hard, and you might wonder if it can be softened. Can we find some other way to respond to the prediction of wrongdoing by making wrongdoing less difficult to avoid without silencing the interests of the wrongdoer? So I want to note first that it's sufficient for my diagnostic goal if the silencing response is available as a way to understand the condemnatory force of moral sanction and its connection to a very strong form of freedom. So even if silencing isn't required by moral freedom, it may yet provide a way of understanding certain strongly held but rarely explained intuitions about desert and condemnation. Nonetheless, I'm at the moment convinced that silencing follows from moral freedom. And I'm going to postpone consideration of some softer responses to first clarify some of the implications of silencing, because even though it's a hard response, I don't think it's quite as hard as it seems. So the silencing response claims that under the presumption of moral freedom, a wrongdoer has forfeited any complaint of fairness that they might have raised on their own behalf about the burdens they suffer as a sanction for a wrong choice. It claims that when one freely chooses wrong, one thereby silences one's own interests and so incurs a particular kind of status that we can call condemnation. But the silencing response does not claim that under moral freedom there are no limitations or restrictions on morally appropriate sanctions. There are. First, because of the real-world possibility of false accusation, sanctions have to be minimal, and to be fair, they have to be enforced uniformly. And so the minimally effective sanction will be the one that even the genuine wrongdoer faces in the real world. So the silencing of the wrongdoer's interest won't have any effect, so to speak, on the material sanctions that it's fair to institute. It will only have an effect on what we earlier called the significance of those sanctions. Anyone who is confident in the accusation and convinced of moral freedom will likewise be confident that the wrongdoer stands morally vulnerable and condemned. They'll see those same material burdens as now carrying this further condemnatory force. Importantly, the silencing response also does not claim that in doing wrong, the wrongdoer is silenced. Rather, in doing wrong, the wrongdoer has silenced their own interests for the purposes of determining the fairness of a sanction. But they aren't themselves silenced. They can make other important complaints. For example, simple human decency requires us to consider the interests of all creatures, even wrongdoers. And certain sanctions are cruel or inhumane, and those should be avoided independently of fairness. And so the wrongdoer can appeal to their own interests and ask for mercy, or complain of indecency or a lack of generosity. More narrowly, a genuine wrongdoer may even complain of the unfairness of a sanction so long as they do so without referencing their own interest. They could complain by invoking the interests of others, like the potentially falsely accused. The only thing that's ruled out by moral freedom is a complaint of unfairness by appeal to their own interests. If you're a wrongdoer, then if you ask others to do unto you, they can fairly reply that you made your bed. For yourself, you can ask for justice. You cannot ask for justice, but only for mercy. Okay. So now, can we find a softer response? Could we, for example, arrange society so that there are fewer opportunities to choose wrongly? We certainly could, and we should, but notice that to be fair, we can't ask potential victims to accept costs or risk that could instead be neutralized by freely avoiding immoral choice. And that's going to be a significant limitation on making such arrangements. I'm going to skip over the next point just for time. So suppose then that we deny moral freedom and allow not just moral failing, but what I'm going to call true moral weakness. In that case, our wills are weak in something like the straightforward sense in which our muscles are sometimes weak. And we then would find ourselves sometimes in the position of procrastinate or of Ulysses, needing to plan around predicted wrongdoing. But now the victim can't protest that a better plan is simply to avoid the wrongdoing. Although avoiding the wrong is certainly a better plan, it might not be an available one. And so once we acknowledge the possibility of moral weakness, we lose the linchpin in the original argument. It's no longer the case that seeking to protect the interests burdened by a sanction against wrongdoing is tantamount to seeking to protect an interest in doing wrong. It may instead be to protect one's interest given the predictable, inexcusable, and yet nonetheless unavoidable fact of wrongdoing. Given moral weakness, we might plan around our own wrongdoing in as much good faith as we're capable of mustering. Of course, to plan around one's wrongdoing is still to plan to do it, and it's still to plan to treat potential victims unfairly, and such plans are inconsistent with the aims of fairness. But the inconsistency is now in us, so to speak. It's no longer in the reasoning about the fairness of a sanction. When reasoning about the fairness of a sanction, we can take into account the interest burdened by unavoidable wrongdoing, just as we can take into account the interests of the unlucky. Wrongdoing on this picture would still be sanctioned, but it couldn't be condemned. We would have returned now to the pricing system. Lots of people are going to feel that if we give up moral sanctions and we use only pricing systems, then we've given up what's distinctive about responses to moral failure, that we're moving to a mere utilitarian system of social control. I strongly disagree. I think that rather than avoid the ugliness of social control by appeal to the distinctive significance of moral sanction, which seems to me trading one attempt at control for another, that we should instead consider the distinctive significance of moral failure, which is not, I would argue, that of being liable to a sanction, but instead it's the significance or importance of standing in certain relationships with other people, relationships of regard or respect. So mattering to other people, not meriting negative consequences, is, I think, what morality and moral responsibility is ultimately about. And so I think we can give up on condemnation without giving up what's distinctive about moral responsibility, but that's a topic for another day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela.
Yes.
So if people have questions, they can ask me in the chat. I want to ask a question while other people are thinking. And you put this example in the classes a lot, you of this lucky drunk driver. And it seems that in this case, he's a wrongdoer. I don't know if he has planned to do this. At least he took the actions in order to drunk drive. How would this account of condemnation will deal with that case in which a lucky drunk driver doesn't hit anyone, but still was in moral fault, at least?
Good. So you're asking about the sort of traditional cases of moral luck. Where somebody has made an immoral choice and yet the outcome, they avoid the horrible outcome. So again, you're kind of asking about the flip case of the one that I've been focusing on. So I've been focusing on the case in which somebody has done the right thing, and yet through bad luck, kills somebody or trips the trigger. And there I want to say sometimes the bad luck, despite the bad luck, the sanction can be fair. You're wondering about a case where somebody makes the poor choice but avoids tripping the trigger. And what should happen in that case? I think that's an interesting question. What in fact happens is they get a lesser, penalty in the law. So you get reckless driving, not manslaughter. How does this intersect with the idea of condemnation? So again, condemnation is a thing that I'm against, right? So I'm trying to occupy a position I don't hold. But my guess is that if I believed in moral freedom, I would think that the person who recklessly drove and yet was, luckily avoided killing anybody did something worthy of condemnation. That reckless choice was something they should have avoided, and that if we could, if like God, we could know for sure when that choice was made, and we weren't vulnerable to false accusations, that condemnation could follow.
Okay. Well, I don't know if there are any other questions right now. So I wanted to thank you so much.
Sure.
We're gonna go to the other stuff that I sent you about, and I'll see you then. Okay. Muchas gracias a todos, y espérenos en 2 semanas más, tendremos la última sesión con Sara Moss y nos vemos. Muchas gracias a todos.